Now we are going to talk about how we should create with the SharePoint framework an ACE solution, or generally speaking, a SharePoint framework solution for ISV willing to offer that solution as a kind of a software as a service offering, hosting their backend code on Azure and having the proper settings in place to make it happen for a multi-tenant solution. So first of all, let me try to set the context. So let's assume that you are an ISV and you want to build a solution. And you want to build a solution which might be an extension of Viva Connection, so an adaptive card extension built with SharePoint Framework. But what I'm going to talk about applies completely also to a SharePoint Framework web part. So just to be clear. And let's say that you want to sell or provide your solution as a software as a service model. You should keep into account that you will have to do some activities to register an application in Azure Active Directory. You will need to do proper hosting on Azure and stuff like that. So practically speaking, there are some architectural challenges that you need to face when you want to do that. First of all, you need, or you should at least create a multi-tenant application and register a multi-tenant application in Azure Active Directory. I say you should because the other option would be to manually register and create an application on every single tenant of every customer, which means you're not offering a software as a service solution because you would have to do setup stuff on every single customer tenant, which is indeed not doable. So you will have to create a multi-tenant solution, and you will have to make your multi-tenant solution available on all of your customers' tenants, and your backend services will need to be multi-tenant aware in order to being able to do that. Plus the fact that your application most likely will need to do something with the target tenants of your customers, like accessing data in SharePoint Online or using Microsoft Graph and other stuff like that. And as such, your customers will need to grant permissions to your applications to do stuff on their own tenant. So there are some requirements from a deployment point of view which need to be satisfied. And that's why we are covering this topic in this demo. Just to give you an idea, let's imagine that you are an ISV again, and you have your own tenant. You registered your application in your own tenant as a multi-tenant application, and then we will see, practically speaking, how and where you can do that. And that you also configure your application in order to have proper permissions to access Microsoft Graph. Then you want to host, for example, on Azure and in an Azure Function app, your backend infrastructure so that your SharePoint Framework solution will rely on this backend infrastructure hosted on a Function app. And you configured your application in Azure AD with a client secret and a client ID in order to being able to get a token to consume target resources in the target tenant. But now the point is that the target tenant is not just one tenant. The target tenant will be any tenant of any of your customers who will get your solution, meaning that there will be the need to register your multi-tenant application in the target tenants. The customer will have to grant the permissions to those applications. And when it's done, any of the customer who will have the application registered and the permission granted will be able, in your custom code, which will be running in SharePoint or in Viva Connections or wherever else you like, as long as you can run SharePoint Framework code, will be able to make a request to your backend infrastructure, providing an access token which will be issued by the Azure Active Directory of your specific customer tenant. And on your backend infrastructure, you will have to validate the token, and you will be able to get access to the backend infrastructure of the customer, so of their SharePoint, of their Microsoft 365 workloads, generally speaking, thanks to the grant of the permissions that the admin in the customer side did for your application. All of these activities require quite some work potentially. And that's why, and thanks God, that SharePoint Framework, starting from version 1.15 point something, helps you a lot in doing that. In fact, starting from this version of SharePoint Framework, there are some useful attributes that you can configure in the package solution.json file, which allow us to have an easy deployment of this kind of solutions. So let me switch to the demo and let me show you how it works in action. So first of all, I want to show you the actual result. This is a demo that we have already seen something like 1 year ago, and which I recently updated in order to have support for these new functionalities that I'm talking about. This is an adaptive card extension extension, actually there are two ACEs, which allow to manage a fake list of orders that you can show, and you can insert additional orders using this ACE into this list of orders. This is an example that you can find also under the sample solution gallery right here. And I think I posted on the chat the link, and if not, I will do it right after this demo. But here you can find an easy access to the source code. You can either download it or view it, and you can see how the solution is built. Now, let me switch to the actual code base. And first of all, we have in the back end of this adaptive card extension an Azure function where we manage the list of orders. This is a really regular orders function, so an Azure function running on Azure, where we have actions like get orders to get the whole list of orders. We can get a single order, we can add a new order and stuff like that. Nothing really special. And under the cover, we work with an in-memory structure for orders just for the sake of having a simple deployment without the need to deploy databases and other stuff, and to let you experiment with this sample without the need to deploy a complex scenario. This Azure function is backed by an application which I registered in Azure Active Directory, and let's assume that I am the ISV selling the solution. Here is in my tenant, in my ISV tenant, let me go here, the application registered in Azure Active Directory. This is an application that I registered simply going to Azure Active Directory and going to app registrations and creating a new app registration. So let me search for it again and let me show you how it is configured. I have a client ID as I have for any other application. In the authentication section, I configured my application to authenticate any Azure AD directory. So it is configured for multi-tenancy. I also configured the web platform in order to have a bunch of redirect URLs configured in my application. Plus, and eventually in the certificates and secret, you can configure an X5 certificate, an X509 certificate, or a client secret to associate to your application if needed. In the API permissions, you can configure your graph or SharePoint permissions. Here, for example, I configure just the user.read permission to keep it really basic and simple. But it can be any set of permission scopes that you like. And then this is the application which is actually used under the cover of my API. And so I'm exposing an API through this application. And that's why I configured a unique URI for my application, which generally speaking should be something readable and understandable. That's why for me it is API pmp.contoso.orders, so a readable name, not just a auto-generated GUID as the predefined value that you get from Azure. And then I configured a couple of permissions, one to read the orders and one to have the full control on the orders. So this is the definition in my ISV tenant, again, assuming that I am the ISV right now, in my ISV tenant of my multi-tenant application in Azure Active Directory. Now, I'm willing to use this application as the entry point for the consumer app, which will be the SharePoint Framework Adaptive Card Extensions. But before moving there, let me switch back a little bit more on the Azure function just to highlight that, as you can see here, for example, in order to add a new order, I have an attribute which is called the function authorize. This is a custom attribute, and you can find the implementation in the sample on GitHub, which will simply declare that in order to being able to call this add order endpoint of my function, I will need to have the orders.fullControl permission in the access token that I will get. Meaning I'm doing authorization control. So as I need the orders full control to add a new order, I simply need the orders.read, or eventually still fine to have the orders full control to get an order. So to read, I simply need the basic permission. To write, I need an additional or advanced permission. And this kind of authorization check can be done and should be done on the Azure function side. At the same time, in the Azure function, because we have configured the application Azure AD to support multiple tenants, we need to be aware of the tenants that we want to support. So if we are offering or selling our solution as a software as a service solution, we should, in the token validation parameters of our function, we should validate the the issuer of the token, meaning the Azure Active Directory tenant, which will issue the access token that will be used to consume our function, our backend. Why? Because as I showed you in the previous diagram, we can have multiple tenants, and each and every tenant will have its own Azure Active Directory, which will be the issuer of the tokens. So in our business logic, we need to validate if the issuer is a tenant of a customer that is basically paying for the service or not. And if not, we will simply say, sorry, you will not get access to my environment. This is a demo one, so I will simply accept any one. But in your real life, you should do proper validation and store eventually a list of allowed or registered or paying customer tenants in a SQL database or in a Cosmos DB or wherever you like. So this is the Azure function. Now, we want to consume this Azure function from SPFX and from our adaptive card extensions. Let me switch to the SPFX solution. This is the adaptive card extension that we were having a look before. This is the managed orders. I will not dig into the implementation details of the ACEs by themselves, because this is not a session about how to implement ACEs. This is a session about how to manage the multi-tenant deployment. But just for the sake of clarity, here in my adaptive card extension, I have in the onInit method, once again, the creation of the AAD client instance through the AAD client factory. And as you can see here, I'm getting a client for this specific URI, which is precisely the one we used to uniquely identify our API in the backend. So through this method call, we get back an AAD HTTP client object, which will be simply provided to a service that we have in our solution, which will be the order service, where we will rely on it to make the actual requests to get, read, update, add, and so on and so forth, the orders through the back-end API. Now, what is interesting from the SharePoint framework point of view is that in the package solution.json file of my solution, right now, I declare that from a web API permission requests point of view, I need for my solution to be fully functional to have access to the resource called pmp.contoso.orders, which is the name of the application that I registered in my tenant, so in the ISV tenant. And I want to have, for example, the permission scope orders.full-control, which is again one of the permissions that I configure in the expose an API section of my Azure AD application. This is what we have been doing for a while now with SharePoint Framework, and by doing that, we can build a package and we can deploy the package in a target tenant. And let me show you how it works when we do such a thing. So let me switch to a demo tenant that I have. And in this tenant, I'm going to add to the app catalog, the new one, the SPPKG file for my solution, as long as I will be able to find the finder. Okay, here it is. So this is my SPPKG for my solution. And if I will upload this package into my target tenant, you will see that, okay, now we have the SPPKG, and SharePoint Framework is smart enough to say, okay, you need to enable this application if you want on all of the sites, because it is a tenant-wide solution. Yes, please do that. And then it will also say, okay, keep into account that for this solution to work properly, we also need to grant some permissions, which are the permissions for my application. Let me go to the API access page. If I will do that right now, I will be able to see that there is a solution, my Contoso orders one, which is pending approval for the orders.full-control permission for the PMP Contoso orders application. However, if I will click on approve, and I'm going to do that, it will fail. Let me show you. You see, I have this error. Why? Because actually, the application that I, as the ISV, registered in my own ISV tenant is not yet available in the customer tenant. And as such, it will not be possible to grant a permission to an application which does not exist in my tenant. Okay, so what I should do would be to open, for example, a tab, and using the admin consent URL that Azure Active Directory provides us, I will be able to register my application onto my tenant and grant the permissions to my application. This admin consent URL will accept the ID, the unique ID of my application, as well as a redirect URI, which is one of those configured in the authentication section of my Azure AD application. Let's do that. By doing that, okay, I will have to authenticate as a tenant admin. And once I will do that, I will be able to register and grant the permissions on my tenant for that specific application. By doing that, I will be able now to register my application and grant the permissions if I will go back to the admin center and I will refresh this page. Every now and then it takes a while, so there is no guarantee that it will already work right now. But even if it will not work exactly right now, in a matter of few seconds or minutes from now, it will be possible to grant the permissions and to approve the permissions for this application so that I will be able, actually it is already working, wonderful. So I will be able to use my solution. Now, as you can see, this process is quite complex from an end user point of view. And that's why Microsoft updated the behavior of SharePoint Framework and made it possible to do something like that. You can add in the package solution.json file of your solution, the app ID and the reply URL of your solution, so that all of the process of doing the registration and the consent of the application will be taken into account by the SharePoint Framework infrastructure rather than by your customer, which is really good in my opinion. So let me build another package for my solution with this updated package solution.json file. So it will take just a few seconds, hopefully. And in the meantime, I can drink something. Not beer, it is not yet 6 p.m., so not yet a beer. Okay, so I have my solution ready. So let me switch back to actually another tenant that I have where I will do the same, but right now I will use my updated package with the new attributes in there. So I upload the packages like as before. As like before, I will have to make it tenant-wide available if I want to do that, enable the app. I will still see the message that we need to grant some permissions to my application. But when I will click to the Go to API access page, now in this tenant, which is a fresh and clean new one, you can notice it by the different color in the top. Just kidding, but yeah, it is a new one, a different one. Now, if I will select the pending permission grant, and I will click on the approve button. By clicking right here on the approve button, you will see that we will have a dialog which will prompt the tenant admin to do the admin registration and consent for my application, eventually on behalf of the whole organization. And as such, a tenant admin will be allowed to do the whole process without the need to know what the admin consent URL is and to know all of the steps needed, but actually just following the admin UI of SharePoint Framework and SharePoint Online, it will be possible to register the application in the tenant and have it ready and available in the target environment. We see the wonderful page of M365 PnP community. And by going back right here, we will soon see that the application is now registered and available with the proper permissions configured. So it will refresh soon, and let's see. And we are, okay, perfect. So if I will go, for example, to the workbench of my tenant in any site collection of my choice, I can now add the orders ACE, the manage orders ACE, and you will see that I will be able to use my orders ACE. I will have a bunch of orders available, and I can play with it in my new target tenant. Oops, let me click on this one. So it is really, really useful and powerful to being able to configure those two settings inside the package solution.json file, rather than having to provide additional documentation and guidance to the customer in order to deploy the solution. One last thing that I want to share with you is that you need to keep into account that for your Azure function to properly work with all of the tenants of your customers, you will also need on the hosting platform, so on Azure, to configure in the cores section that you want to allow access to all of the cores, because actually all of your customers will come from different URLs. The request will come from tenant.sharepoint.com of every different customer that you have. So you can either configure one by one all of the tenants of your customers in the list of course enabled in this setting, or eventually you can configure an asterisk to make it possible to use any consumer for your API. Up to you. This is really important, fundamental. Otherwise, your API will not work in the backend of SharePoint framework. That said, this is again a really useful technique which is provided by Microsoft by SharePoint framework to automate the registration of a solution and to have an easy and speedy deployment of SharePoint framework solutions. Just as a reminder, remember to configure properly the reply URL, because it will be the one you will use as the return URL after the consent and the registration. Remember to provide a meaningful name for your unique URI. Remember to configure course, and remember to validate the issuer in the token validation of your Azure function. And that said, I think that's all for me. Back to you, Derek. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Paolo.